The oil barrel hit the lead bandits so perfectly, at such a precise angle, that I genuinely wondered for a second if I'd planned it myself and simply forgotten. I hadn't. I never do. That's the whole problem, and also, somehow, the whole solution. My name is Kaelan Vantor, and 6 months ago, I was the most disappointing son in a noble house that had run out of polite ways to say so. Today, I run a village that's starting to look, against every reasonable expectation, like it might survive the year. And I've got a crown-appointed noblewoman deciding whether that village is worth her family's protection. A bandit problem that's about to become considerably more political than anyone expected. And a rival house that's just started paying very close attention to everything I've built. But before I tell you about the fight that finally convinced Isolde Ashgrave I wasn't the joke her intelligence reports made me out to be, let me back up. Let me start with the mill. Let me start from the beginning of this part of the story anyway. I promise the rest of it earns the weight. There's a very particular satisfaction in watching a broken thing become a working thing, and I don't think anyone warns you about it before you experience it firsthand. I'd spent my whole life around estates that simply worked, mills that turned, roads that connected, granaries that didn't host something with too many legs, and I'd never once thought about the fact that somebody, at some point, had to make all of that happen from nothing. Hollowmere taught me that lesson in the most literal way available. It handed me nothing and dared me to make it work anyway. The mill came first, because Aldous had made it clear in his own sour, precise way that flour was the difference between a hard winter and a dead one. The wheel itself wasn't beyond repair. It needed new paddles, a straightened axle, and a mill race that hadn't silted up from a decade of nobody caring enough to dredge it. Simple problems, in theory. In practice, every single one of them required labor Hollowmere didn't have much of, and materials it had even less of. And I spent the better part of 2 weeks doing the unglamorous work of turning a list of impossible problems into a list of merely difficult ones. I want to walk you through exactly how that worked, because I think it matters more than people give it credit for. Everyone assumes rebuilding a place like Hollowmere is about grand decisions, a bold plan, a stirring speech, a single dramatic turning point. It isn't. It's about deciding on a wet Tuesday morning whether to spend your last 3 days of spare labor dredging the mill race or reinforcing the granary roof, knowing that whichever one you choose, the other problem gets meaningfully worse while you're not looking at it. I made that decision 4 separate times that fortnight, and I got it wrong at least once, when a section of the granary roof I deprioritized gave way in a hard rain and cost us 2 days of grain we genuinely couldn't spare. I want to be honest about that failure, because I think it's important. The skill didn't save me from it. It let the roof fall exactly the way a neglected roof falls, water and all, because losing 2 days of grain wasn't the kind of catastrophe that met whatever threshold my path required to intervene. I minded that more than I expected to. It turns out being occasionally, ordinarily wrong stings considerably more once you've gotten used to the universe covering for you. You're allowed to make mistakes, you know, Mira told me, finding me standing in the ruined granary the next morning, doing the specific, useless thing of staring at a problem as though staring hard enough might undo it. Nobody expects the Lord of Hollowmere to be right every single time. I expect it of myself, I said, which was true, and which she looked at for a long moment like she was deciding whether to argue with it. That's going to make you miserable eventually, she said instead, if you don't learn to let some of it go. She didn't wait for my answer. She picked up a shovel, handed me a second one, and put me to work clearing the wreckage instead of standing in it, which I've come to understand was her answer to most problems in life, mine included. Mira became the village's formal administrator that same fortnight, though became undersells it considerably, since she'd been doing the job without the title for years. I simply made official what had already been true. Over Aldis's initial objection, not because he doubted her competence, which nobody in Hollowmere doubted, but because he'd apparently spent 30 years perfecting the art of pretending nothing in this village could ever officially improve, and my paperwork threatened to ruin the bit. You're putting my name on a document, Mira said, reading over the appointment I drafted, with an expression somewhere between suspicion and something warmer she was working hard to keep off her face. In ink, with a seal. That's generally how appointments work, yes. Nobles don't usually put a blacksmith's daughter's name on anything that matters, she said, and there was an old, tired argument buried under that sentence, one I suspected went back considerably further than the 4 stewards before me. Then I suppose, I said, we're simply doing this one differently. She looked at that document for a long moment, and then at me, and something in her expression settled into place. Not quite trust, not yet, but the specific shape trust takes right before it arrives. Careful, she said. Keep doing things differently, and people are going to start expecting it from you. Good, I said. I'd rather be expected to do things well than expected to fail politely. The mill race, once we'd cleared it, ran clean within a week. The wheel turned on the very first strong gust after Mira and 2 of the sturdier village men reset the axle. And I want to tell you honestly that I stood there watching that ancient, useless piece of wood finally do the one thing it had been built for, and felt something in my chest that no amount of noble ceremony back in the capital had ever managed to produce. It wasn't glory. It was better than glory. It was proof. The trade route came next, and it was considerably harder, because a road doesn't care how satisfying your other victories have been. It required convincing 3 separate merchant houses that a 3-day detour to Hollowmere was worth their time, which meant it required something to sell that was worth the detour, which meant it required the mill to actually be producing a surplus before anyone believed the pitch. I solved it the only way I know to solve a problem with too many dependent parts. I broke it down, worked the pieces I could work immediately, and trusted that the rest would fall into place once the first domino tipped. It mostly did. The skill helped exactly once during those 2 weeks, in the smallest, most anticlimactic way imaginable. A merchant's wagon wheel that should have snapped clean through on the old eastern track, instead held, against all reasonable mechanical judgment, just long enough to reach Hollowmere's newly repaired road, where it promptly gave out in full view of the merchant's entire delegation, who took it as a sign that our road, at least, was worth traveling. I remember standing at the edge of the village, watching that wheel finally surrender, exactly where it was most useful for it to surrender, and thinking, not for the first time, that my skill had an absolutely dreadful sense of humor and an unerring sense of timing, and that I was going to have to make my peace with both of those things being permanently, inseparably true. The first proper market day Hollowmere had seen in years happened not long after that, and I want to tell you honestly that I hadn't expected it to feel like much of anything. A handful of merchant stalls, some traded goods, nothing that would have registered as remarkable anywhere else in the kingdom. Instead, I stood at the edge of the square, watching villagers who spent months bartering quietly among themselves, suddenly haggling openly, laughing over prices, arguing about the quality of someone's dyed wool with the specific enthusiastic outrage of people who finally had something worth arguing about, and felt something considerably larger than pride settle into my chest. Mira found me there, arms crossed, watching the same scene with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, something almost soft, underneath the usual dry composure. First market in 4 years, she said. Aldous kept records of the last one. I think he half expected to never need them again. How does it feel? I asked, seeing it come back. She was quiet for a moment, watching a group of children chase each other between the stalls with the specific reckless joy of children who'd finally been given somewhere safe to run. Like something I stopped letting myself want, she said finally, is happening anyway. She glanced at me sideways, something unguarded flickering across her face, before she caught it and put the usual dry humor back in place. Don't let it go to your head, my lord. One market day doesn't make you a miracle worker. Wouldn't dream of it, I said, though privately, watching her watch her village come back to life, I let myself feel exactly as pleased with myself as the moment deserved. Isolde Ashgrave arrived 11 days after the mill wheel first turned, and I want to be honest about my first impression of her because it set the tone for everything that came after. I liked her immediately, and I resented liking her immediately, which is, I've come to understand, roughly how most of my best relationships have started. She rode in with an escort of 4, dressed in the sort of understated, expensive traveling clothes that managed to say, I could afford considerably more than this, and choosing not to is itself a message, without a single word being spoken. And she dismounted in the village square with the specific, unhurried confidence of a woman who has never once doubted that a room would wait for her to be ready. Kaelan Vantor, she said, before I'd introduced myself, in a tone that made it clear she'd read every report the Crown had ever filed on me, and found most of them insufficiently interesting. I'm told you're the reason Hollowmere suddenly has a functioning mill, a repaired trade road, and considerably more optimism than a valley like this has any right to. I'm also told you were considered the family embarrassment 8 months ago. I confess, I'm curious which version of those reports is closer to true. Both, probably, I said. I've found the two aren't as contradictory as people assume. Something flickered across her face. Not quite surprise, but close to it. The look of someone who'd expected to spend this conversation managing a defensive, overeager noble and had instead run directly into someone who wasn't particularly interested in being managed. I'm here on the Crown's behalf, she said, to assess whether Hollowmere's recent progress represents an investment worth the kingdom's continued attention, or a temporary improvement that collapses the moment scrutiny arrives. House Ashgrave has a certain amount of influence over which conclusion gets written in that report. I'd advise you to take that seriously. I take everything seriously, I said. I simply don't perform taking things seriously, which I understand is a different skill entirely, and one most of the nobility I grew up around never bothered learning. She almost smiled at that. Almost, the corner of her mouth twitching in a way she caught and disciplined back into neutrality within half a second. But not quite fast enough that I missed it. I look forward, she said, to finding out whether you're as competent as you are convinced of your own wit. Likewise, I said, regarding whichever version of you shows up once the assessment gets tedious. She laughed at that, a short, surprised sound she clearly hadn't planned on giving me, and covered by turning to address her escort about their quarters. But I'd heard it, and I suspected she knew I had, and something about that exchange settled into my chest. The way the mill wheel finally turning had settled there 2 weeks earlier. Proof of something. I just wasn't sure yet what. Mira, watching the whole exchange from the smithy doorway with her arms crossed, caught my eye once Isolde had turned away, and gave me a look that needed no translation whatsoever. I ignored it, with the specific dignity of a man who knows exactly how transparent he's being and has decided to be transparent anyway. Isolde's quarters, once she'd inspected them, turned out to be considerably less grand than I'd expected her to demand. She took the smallest of the 3 rooms I'd offered, the one facing the trade road rather than the one with the better view, and when I asked why, she looked at me like the answer should have been obvious. I'm here to assess whether this village functions, she said. Not to be comfortable while I do it. I'd rather watch the road than the view. The road tells me more. Most of the Crown's assessors I've met, I said, would have taken the view and complained about the road. Most of the Crown's assessors, she said, are here to collect a favorable dinner and an unfavorable report they can file without ever leaving the capital. I am not most of the Crown's assessors. There was an edge under that sentence, old and a little tired, the specific weariness of someone who had spent years being underestimated by people who assumed a woman sent to observe was a woman sent to be managed. I recognized the shape of it, because I'd been wearing a version of it myself since the font ruined my future in front of 200 witnesses. Then I imagine, I said, we understand each other rather better than either of us expected to, this early in the conversation. She studied me for a beat too long before answering, and I found myself, not for the first time that day, cataloging exactly how she held herself. Spine straight, expression controlled, the whole practiced architecture of a woman who had learned early that any crack in the surface would be used against her by someone. "Don't presume understanding you haven't earned yet, Kaelan Vantor," she said, but there was no real heat in it, more habit than warning, and I decided, watching her walk the length of the room, checking the window latch with brisk, efficient hands, that I liked her considerably more than the situation strictly called for. Isolde's assessment turned out to mean, in practice, that she attached herself to nearly everything I did over the following days, watching, taking notes I never once saw her actually write down, asking questions sharp enough that I suspected she already knew most of the answers and simply wanted to see how I'd explain them. I found I didn't mind. There is a particular pleasure in being tested by someone who actually understands what they're testing for, rather than someone simply looking for an excuse to fail you. And Isolde, whatever else she was not interested in an easy failure. "You're rebuilding faster than the reports suggested," she said, 4 days into her stay, walking the new trade road beside me while her escort trailed at a respectful distance. "Faster than should be possible with the labor and materials available to you. I've seen the ledgers. The numbers don't fully explain the results." "Good administration explains a great deal," I said, which was true, and also not the entire truth, and I suspected from the look she gave me that she knew precisely which parts I was declining to elaborate on. "There are rumors," she said carefully, "about the nature of your path, that it isn't merely a poor cousin of the more prestigious ones, the way the font's verdict implied. That things around you tend to resolve themselves in ways that defy reasonable explanation." "Rumors are rarely reliable." "No," she agreed. "But you haven't denied it, which is its own kind of answer." She studied me for a long moment, the political calculation in her expression giving way, briefly, to something more genuinely curious. "I don't need the truth today, Kaelan Vantor, but I'll want it eventually if House Ashgrave is going to stake its credibility on you being exactly what you appear to be." "When you want it," I said, "I'll give it to you honestly. I've found honesty tends to survive scrutiny better than a well-managed lie ever does." She held my gaze a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, and I found myself, not for the first time that week, cataloging the specific shape of her attention the way I'd catalog any other useful piece of information, except this particular piece of information came with an entirely different set of consequences attached to it, ones I was only beginning to let myself consider. The bandits hit the trade route 9 days after Isolde arrived, which meant she was there to see exactly how Hollowmere handled its first real crisis, which meant I had roughly no margin at all for anything going wrong. We'd known they were coming, in the vague, unsatisfying way you know a storm is coming before you can see the clouds. Merchants further down the road had reported losses, and Aldous' network of quiet, unofficial informants had confirmed a band operating out of the old Quarry Caves, 8 miles east. I'd spent 2 days preparing a response with the handful of able-bodied men Hollowmere could spare, Mira among them, because she'd made it very clear that she was not staying behind to mine the forge while her own trade route got robbed. I remember the night before, going over the terrain map with Isolde by lamplight, and her asking the one question that told me exactly how seriously she'd already started taking Hollowmere's survival as something more than an assessment. "What happens," she said, "if this goes badly? If the bandits are better funded than a simple opportunist band has any right to be, and this turns out to be the first move in something larger?" "Then we adapt," I said, "the same way we've adapted to everything else this village has handed me since I arrived." "That's not a plan," she said. "That's a philosophy." "Most of my best decisions," I said, "started as philosophies before anyone had time to turn them into plans." She didn't look reassured by that exactly, but something in her expression shifted toward a kind of resigned respect. The look of someone deciding to trust a method she didn't fully understand yet, because the results so far had been difficult to argue with. They came at dusk, 11 of them, better armed than I'd expected for a group operating this far from any real supply line. Which told me something, about who might be funding them, that I filed away for later and didn't have time to examine properly, because the fighting had already started. I want to tell you honestly what real combat felt like, because it wasn't at all what I'd trained for in the estate's courtyard. It was faster, uglier, and considerably less concerned with anyone's dignity. I'd drilled the same clean combination for years, the exact strike my old swordmaster had made me repeat until my arms shook, the one I'd been quietly proud of since I was 14. And I brought it out against the bandit leader at precisely the moment it mattered most. Years of discipline crystallizing into a single, perfect motion. The skill had other ideas. Mid-strike, an overturned oil barrel, knocked loose from a merchant's wagon during the initial chaos, rolled directly into the space where my perfect strike was supposed to land, catching the bandit leader across the shins at exactly the height and speed to send him sprawling directly into his own advancing men, who went down in a tangle of limbs and profanity that took out a further 3 attackers entirely by accident. My blade, mid-swing, connected with nothing but air, and I stood there for one deeply undignified second, looking like a man who had just lost an argument with a barrel. I had that, I said to no one, mostly to myself, mostly for the record. I want that noted somewhere. I had that. The skill, as ever, declined to respond to feedback. I recovered fast enough that it barely cost us anything. The bandits, tangled and disoriented, were considerably easier to finish than they would have been standing, and within another few minutes, the fight was effectively over. 4 bandits fled into the tree line. The rest either captured or unable to continue the argument. Mira had accounted for 2 on her own, with a blacksmith's economy of motion that made my years of formal training look faintly decorative by comparison. And I made a private note to ask her, later, exactly where she'd learned to fight like that, because it clearly hadn't been from watching her father work a forge. I asked her that same question not 20 minutes later, once the last of the bandits had been bound, and the adrenaline had started to drain out of my hands in that specific, shaking way it does once a fight is actually over. She wiped her blade clean with a rag that had seen considerably better decades, and gave me a look I couldn't immediately place. My mother, she said, before she died, she wasn't always a smith's wife. There's a version of my family's history nobody in this village talks about much, and I've never seen much reason to correct that. She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, in the specific tone of someone who had made peace with a hard fact a long time ago, and simply carried it rather than displaying it. I'll tell you the rest of it eventually. Not tonight. Tonight, I'd rather just be glad you're not currently bleeding out somewhere I can't reach you. Noted, I said, and reciprocated. She almost smiled at that, tired and real, and went back to checking the bound prisoners with the same brisk competence she brought to everything. And I filed away, not for the first time, that there was clearly considerably more to Mira Holt than even Hollowmere's own gossip had ever managed to capture. Isolde found me afterward, checking a shallow cut along my forearm with the same clinical focus she brought to everything, and there was something new in the way she looked at me. Not the polite appraising distance from our first meeting, but something that had clearly recalculated itself somewhere in the last 10 minutes. An oil barrel, she said slowly, rolled into exactly the right position at exactly the right moment to break an 11-man ambush in your favor. Fortunate timing, I said. I don't believe in fortunate timing, she said. Not 4 separate times in the same afternoon, and not from a man whose village has been rebuilding itself at a rate that shouldn't be mathematically possible. She looked at me for a long moment, and I watched her make a decision behind her eyes, the specific look of someone choosing to trust a hunch she couldn't yet prove. Whatever you actually are, Kaelan Vantor, she said, I don't think it's the joke the font made you out to be. I think it might be considerably more dangerous than that. I mean that as a compliment, in case it wasn't clear. It wasn't entirely, I said, but I'll take it as one anyway. Mira found me alone at the edge of the village that same night, both of us too wound up from the fight to sleep, and I want to tell you about that conversation carefully, because it's the one I've turned over in my head more times than almost any other. You could have died today, she said, without preamble, sitting down on the fence beside me. Barrel or no barrel, 11 men is 11 men. I didn't, I said. No, she agreed. You didn't, because something keeps deciding, over and over, that you're allowed not to. She looked at me sideways, the firelight from the distant torches catching the line of her jaw, and there was something unguarded in her expression that I hadn't seen from her before, not once, in all the weeks of banter and shared labor that had gotten us here. I keep waiting for the day it doesn't. I don't know what I'll do on that day. You'll do what you always do, I said, something considerably more competent than whatever I was attempting. She didn't laugh at that, which told me more than any answer would have. I wasn't sure about you, she said quietly, when you first rode in. 5th steward in 6 years, another noble son here to either fail politely or pretend to care for exactly as long as it took to get bored. I've buried my expectations of nobility a long time ago, Kaelan. It's safer that way. And now, she said, I'm considerably less sure how to keep them buried. I didn't say anything clever back to that, which I want you to understand was a deliberate choice, because for once the moment didn't need cleverness. We sat there together at the edge of a village that was, against every reasonable expectation, starting to become something worth defending. And I thought about how strange it was that the worst insult of my entire life had led me directly here, to this fence, beside this woman, and I found, for possibly the first time since the font ruined my future in front of 200 witnesses, that I wasn't angry about any of it anymore. She stayed a while longer after that, neither of us saying much, until the fire from the distant watch torches had burned down to something closer to embers. And when she finally stood to leave, she paused, hand briefly on my shoulder, in a gesture that lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than the situation strictly required. "Get some sleep, my lord," she said, and there was something almost tender buried under the familiar dry edge of her voice. "Hollowmere's not done needing you yet." I didn't sleep much that night, if I'm honest, though not for any reason involving danger. I lay awake turning over the particular warmth of her hand on my shoulder, the specific unguarded look on her face by the firelight, and thought that whatever this was becoming between us, it had built itself the way everything worthwhile in Hollowmere had built itself so far, slowly, out of shared labor and earned trust, with no shortcut from the skill anywhere in sight. I found I preferred it that way. Some things I decided ought to be entirely mine to get right or wrong. Nix arrived in the village 3 days later, which I should probably explain, because I haven't told you yet how that particular negotiation resolved itself. Or what exactly walked out of that shrine with me the night the tree line caught fire. I'll tell you the whole thing properly when there's time to do it justice. For now, what matters is that she settled into Hollowmere with the specific, unbothered confidence of someone who has decided, after 3 centuries of captivity, that freedom is simply another problem to be managed efficiently. And she managed it by quietly appointing herself head of a department nobody had known Hollowmere needed until she'd already built it. "You have no security," she said, on her second day in the village, in the tone of someone delivering an obvious diagnosis to a patient too polite to have mentioned the symptoms. "No intelligence network. No idea which of your own villagers might be worth bribing by whoever's watching you from outside this valley. I read intentions, Kaelan. It's the single most useful thing about me that has nothing to do with what everyone assumes is the single most useful thing about me." "I'm aware," I said, "and grateful, and slightly concerned about how quickly you've already mapped out an entire department I didn't know I needed." "You needed it roughly a month ago," she said. "I'm simply the first person efficient enough to notice." Mira and Isolde, to their considerable credit, and my ongoing quiet amazement, took to Nix's arrival with none of the friction I'd braced myself for. I'd half expected some version of the jealous theater I'd heard about in every story involving more than one woman and a single man foolish enough to be liked by all of them, and instead got something else entirely. 3 formidable women, entirely aware of each other and entirely unbothered by it, choosing deliberately and without any of the drama I braced for, to simply see where this went rather than perform a rivalry none of them actually felt. "She's not wrong about the security gap," Mira said, the first time the three of them were in a room together, studying Nyx with the frank, assessing look of someone deciding whether a new tool was worth the trouble of learning to use. "I rarely am," Nyx said, entirely unbothered about anything that matters. Isolde, for her part, simply watched the exchange with the calculating interest of someone filing away a new variable in an already complicated equation, and said nothing at all, which from her, I was beginning to understand, was its own kind of endorsement. Nyx proved her worth within the week, in a way that made even Aldous grudgingly admit she'd earned her place. A trader passing through claimed to be a simple merchant, looking to establish a regular route, all friendly smiles and reasonable prices, and every instinct I had said to take the deal. Nyx pulled me aside before I'd signed anything. "He's lying," she said, without preamble. "Not about the goods, about who sent him. There's fear underneath the friendliness, the specific kind that comes from being told what happens if he fails, not what happens if he succeeds. Someone's using him to map your defenses, your storehouses, how many men you can actually field. He doesn't want to be doing it. That doesn't make him harmless." I confronted the man carefully, without accusation, simply asking questions Nyx suggested I ask, watching his answers unravel exactly the way she'd predicted they would. He broke within minutes, admitting he'd been paid by an intermediary he'd never met to catalog exactly what I had and didn't have, in exchange for a debt of his brother's being quietly forgiven. I let him go, with a message for whoever had sent him. Hollowmere knew it was being watched, and Hollowmere was no longer the kind of place that watching could catch unprepared. "That," Aldous said afterward, in the tone of a man revising a long-held opinion against his will, "was considerably more useful than I expected a succubus to be. Everyone expects considerably less of me than I actually am," Nyx said, entirely unbothered. "I've found that's usually where the opportunity lives." House Cressmont's interest in Hollowmere, when it finally surfaced, arrived exactly the way Osric had warned me these things tend to arrive, sideways, disguised as something else, and confirmed by a contact he claimed to have simply happened to remember at precisely the moment it became useful. "Cressmont's been asking questions in Vestport," he told me, appearing at my door with the specific, unhurried timing that made me increasingly certain his forgetfulness was, at minimum, 70% theater. "About your trade route, about your mill, about why a valley that was worth nothing 8 months ago is suddenly worth someone's attention." He paused, in the manner of a man remembering something for the very first time that he had, in fact, clearly been sitting on for days. "Oh, and I happen to know the man they've been asking. Lovely fellow. Terrible taste in wine. Owes me a favor from an incident involving a shipment of enchanted salt I believe I've mentioned." "You mentioned it," I said. "Did I?" Osric said, entirely unbothered, and told me nothing further that day, though I noticed in the weeks that followed that every single piece of information he'd claimed to have just remembered turned out to be exactly, precisely correct. I asked him once, exasperated after the third such revelation in as many days, why he never simply told me things plainly the first time, instead of performing forgetfulness until the exact moment it became dramatically useful. He looked at me with something almost like genuine surprise, as though the question itself hadn't occurred to him in centuries. "Because, boy," he said, "information given too early gets ignored. Information given at exactly the moment it matters gets remembered. I've been doing this a very long time. I promise you, the timing is not an accident." Then he wandered off to argue with Whiskers about something, and I stood there turning that over, because it was, infuriatingly, the single most useful piece of advice about managing people he'd given me since I'd met him. And he delivered it with all the gravity of a man discussing turnips. Isolde's expression, when I told her what Osric had learned, went carefully neutral in the specific way that told me she was thinking considerably harder than her face was letting on. Cresmont doesn't send scouts for curiosity, she said. If they're asking questions in Vestport about your trade route, they're already deciding whether Hollowmere's rise is a threat worth addressing before it becomes a threat worth fearing. My family's interests and Cresmont's have never aligned well. That may work in your favor. It may also make this considerably more dangerous before it gets easier. I've found, I said, that most things in my life follow exactly that order. She almost smiled at that, the same reluctant, disciplined, near smile from our first conversation, but it faded faster than usual, replaced by something more troubled. There's something you should understand about my position here, she said, before this goes any further. My family's report on Hollowmere doesn't exist in isolation. Whatever I write reflects on House Ashgrave's judgment. If I recommend the Crown continue investing in you, and Cresmont makes a move that damages that investment, the failure attaches to my name as much as yours. I'm not simply observing you, Kaelan. I'm gambling my family's standing on the outcome. I didn't realize the stakes were quite that personal for you, I said. They rarely tell you that part, she said, when they hand you an assignment like this one. You're expected to discover it yourself, at exactly the moment it becomes inconvenient. There was an old bitterness under that, carefully controlled, and I understood, watching her, that whatever calculating distance she'd arrived with, it had never been the whole truth of her. Simply the armor she'd learned to wear before anyone could use the rest of her against her. Then let's make sure, I said, that neither of our names attaches to a failure. She looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes that I couldn't fully name yet, and said quietly, I'd like that, more than I probably should, given how briefly I've known you. We didn't have long to sit with that admission, because Cresmont's first real move arrived only 4 days later, and it arrived exactly the way these things tend to, according to Osric. Small, deniable, and considerably more dangerous than it looked at first glance. The granary fires started just past midnight, in the section we'd only just finished repairing. And I want to be honest, that for the first several minutes, nobody knew whether it was an accident or something worse. Mira had the bucket lights organized, before I'd even fully understood what was happening. Aldous directing water diversion from the mill race with the calm precision of a man who had clearly planned for exactly this kind of disaster, despite 30 years of pretending Hollowmere wasn't worth planning for. We saved most of the grain. We lost the roof, again, and this time I didn't need the skill to tell me it wasn't bad luck. Nix found the truth of it before dawn, working the crowd of villagers who'd gathered to help, reading the specific texture of fear and guilt the way she read everything else. One of your own started it, she told me quietly, once the fire was out and most of Hollowmere had gone back to salvaging what could be salvaged. Not out of malice toward you. Out of fear for someone else. There's a debt involved, and a family member held somewhere outside the valley as leverage. Cresmont didn't need to send soldiers. They only needed to find the one person in this village desperate enough to be useful to them. I found the man within the hour. One of Aldis's own network of quiet informants, as it happened, which told me Cresmont's intelligence on Hollowmere was considerably better than I'd have liked. He confessed everything before I'd even finished asking, shaking, more relieved to be caught than afraid of what came next, and told me his sister was being held in a Cresmont-adjacent household 2 days' ride from here. Her safety, the price of his cooperation. I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. Not anger, though I expected anger, and not the cold calculation I usually bring to problems like this. I felt something closer to recognition. This man hadn't chosen to become Cresmont's weapon any more than I had chosen to become Second Path. The world had simply handed him an impossible position and dared him to survive it, the same way it had handed me Hollowmere. We'll get her back, I told him, and I meant it, though I had no idea yet how, and you're going to help us understand exactly what Cresmont thinks it knows about us in the meantime. Not as punishment, as the only way either of us gets out of this cleanly. Isolde, listening to the entire exchange with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable, waited until the man had been led away before she spoke. "You could have made an example of him," she said. "Most lords would have." "Most lords," I said, "didn't spend 18 years being told they were the example of what happens when the font makes a mistake. I have a certain amount of sympathy left over for people the world's put in an impossible position." She studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression settled the way it had settled once before, on the road, days earlier. The specific look of someone recalibrating a judgment they'd already half decided on. "I'm starting to understand," she said quietly, "why the font's verdict never actually fit you. It never described what you were. It only described what everyone assumed a mistake ought to look like." We spent the following 3 days planning the rescue with the same methodical care I brought to every other impossible problem Hollowmere had handed me. And I want to walk you through it, because I think it says something about who'd gathered around me by that point, that a task like this, retrieving a hostage from a household 2 days' ride into contested territory, without Cresmont ever realizing we'd done it, didn't feel remotely as hopeless as it should have. Iseult provided the political shape of the problem first, laying out exactly which Cresmont-adjacent households held sway in that region, which of them owed House Ashgrave old, unspoken debts that might be quietly called in, and which routes in and out of the area were watched closely enough to matter. "I can get us information," she said, spreading a hand-drawn map across the table in the steward's house. "But I can't be seen doing it officially. If Cresmont learns House Ashgrave assisted you directly, it complicates everything I'm here to assess, and it hands them a grievance they don't currently have standing to raise." "Unofficially, then," I said. "Unofficially," she agreed, "is a language I speak fluently." Nix handled the part neither of us could, reading from second-hand accounts and the nervous testimony of our informant. Exactly which of the household's guards might be susceptible to persuasion, bribery, or simple distraction, and which would need to be avoided outright. "There's one," she said, studying the layout Iseult had sketched, "who resents his position enough that he's practically advertising it. Overworked, underpaid, and recently passed over for a promotion he clearly expected. People like that don't need much convincing. They need someone to finally notice them." Mira, for her part, simply asked the one question nobody else had thought to ask yet. "How are we getting her out once we've found her? A hostage who spent weeks afraid isn't going to run confidently through unfamiliar country in the dark. We need someone she trusts before we need someone fast." That, in the end, became her role. Not the fighting, though she made it clear she intended to be there for that too, but the quiet, patient work of being the first friendly face the girl saw, the one who'd explain that her brother had sent help, and that the worst of it was nearly over. It was, I thought, watching her volunteer for it without a shred of hesitation, exactly the kind of leadership Hollowmere had been quietly running on long before I arrived, and exactly the kind the reports back in the capital would never think to measure. Osric, characteristically, contributed nothing to the planning itself, and everything to the execution, in the sense that he simply appeared on the morning we departed, uninvited, riding a mule that looked considerably better bred than the rest of his belongings, and announced that he happened to know the household steward we'd be dealing with, from an entirely unrelated matter involving a duchess, a debt, and a small misunderstanding about a shipment of enchanted salt. "Another shipment of enchanted salt?" I said. "There was a great deal of enchanted salt in circulation that decade," he said, with the air of a man who considered the subject closed. "It'll help, trust me." I did trust him, which continued to surprise me every single time I noticed myself doing it. And I want to tell you honestly that as we rode out of Hollowmere that morning, 5 of us, plus one deeply unbothered mule, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel this early into my exile to the map's ragged edge. Something close to having a family, built entirely out of people the rest of the kingdom had underestimated exactly as thoroughly as it had underestimated me. We reached the edge of the Cresmont-adjacent estate 2 days later, exactly on schedule. And I'll tell you honestly that everything about the approach went considerably smoother than I'd allowed myself to hope. Osric's guard, exactly as promised, proved willing to look the other way in exchange for a debt quietly acknowledged rather than a bribe crudely offered. Nix confirmed the household's actual patrol patterns matched what our informant had described, with one critical difference. An additional watch had been added to the eastern wall in just the last week, which told all of us, without anyone needing to say it aloud, that Cresmont was expecting more trouble than a single frightened villager's family. "They know someone might come," Isolde said quietly, studying the extra watch from our position in the tree line. "Which means either our informant talked, which I doubt, given the state we found him in, or Cresmont's grown considerably more cautious about Hollowmere than a simple assessment report would explain." "Or," Nix said, something sharpening in her expression that I'd come to recognize as her paying very close attention to something the rest of us hadn't caught yet. "They're not simply protecting a hostage. They're using her as bait, and they've been waiting for exactly this." I felt the particular focused calm settle over me that I've come to associate with a genuine crisis rather than a mere problem. The specific quiet that comes right before you commit to something you can no longer take back. I looked at the 4 people who'd ridden 2 days into hostile territory beside me without a single one of them asking whether. I was certain this was worth the risk, and I made the only decision that felt honest, given everything Hollowmere had already taught me about impossible problems. "Then we go in assuming it's a trap," I said, "and we make sure it costs them more than it costs us." I didn't know yet, moving toward that wall in the dark with the people who'd become, against every reasonable expectation the font had ever set for me, the closest thing to family I'd had since riding out of the capital, exactly how right Nix's instinct was about to prove, or how much that Eastern Watch was about to complicate every careful plan we'd made in that steward's house 3 days earlier. If you want to find out whether Hollowmere's first real rescue turns into its first real disaster, and whether Cresmont's trap catches the people I care most about in this world, subscribe, ring the bell, and stay close. Things are about to get considerably less polite.